All right, everybody. So the Sony A7R IV was announced just yesterday, and I wanted to take a look at it. I have not looked at any reviews. I've managed to stay away and not watch any YouTube videos about it or read anything about it because I wanted to give my own take on it, and I don't want to contaminate my own impressions with those of others. So I pulled up a website here with a list of the features of the A7R IV. I thought I'd go through them and share with you what I think about it. All right, so straight up off the bat is the resolution. This is an R camera, and understandably, it has a high resolution sensor, 61 megapixels. And supposedly, it can do pixel shifting to give you an even larger resolution. So it looks like with pixel shifting, you can get something like a 240 megapixel picture. So, right away, when you're dealing with 61 megapixel pictures up to 240 megapixel pictures, you got to wonder who this is for. And the answer is it's probably not for you, and it's probably not for me. It's not for the majority of us. So there's going to be a lot of people who are going to look at this and be like who is this camera for, right? And I can kind of understand that sentiment. It's not for most people. That said, it clearly does have a reason to exist. There are definitely people out there who need this kind of resolution. So who? Well, professional photographers, people who need to produce large prints. There are, pictures that sometimes need to be printed to be as big as the side of a building, right? So clearly, for those applications, you need cameras with huge megapixel counts. So what bothers me is that Sony and other companies are also guilty of this, but Sony, they will produce a camera and market it to the general public as though it's a general public camera, even though honestly the majority of us will never need this kind of megapixel count. It's kind of like what Apple does with the Mac Pro. So Apple designs the Mac Pro and markets the Mac Pro to be this pretty sexy thing, and they advertise it through the press to everybody and kind of generate interest amongst the general public. And so everybody wants a Mac Pro, even though most of us don't need something like that. It's super expensive, and it's super expensive for a reason, because all the components in there are like super premium and can handle huge data rate transfers and stuff, and as things like error checking memory that most of us don't need. But Apple, they do this very well. They produce a product that is clearly meant for a very small segment of the world. Professional video producers, professional audio producers, people who do maybe a lot of 3D design work, people who require that kind of computing power. They're very few and far in between. So clearly, the Mac Pro has a reason to exist, but Apple they just market it to everybody and generate interest amongst everybody. And then of course there's tons of people out there who are going to complain about how expensive it is and how they can't afford it and blah, blah, blah. And who is that for? And the truth is, it's not for you. And I'm sorry, but Apple is using you to generate interest. As I feel it's the same thing with Sony with this camera. And it's not just Sony. There are other camera companies that make high-end, high-resolution cameras. They're not for you, but they're for somebody. The problem with Sony is that they generally market to the mass public, and they've put this kind of premium sensor in a body that is generally targeted towards enthusiasts and prosumers. Certainly people like you and me, right? Because we can make use of an A7 Mark III. So if you have something else that's in the same form factor, you might think, well, maybe I can get that too. But like honestly, most people don't need a 61 megapixel camera. You can just imagine how big those file sizes are. They're probably going to be on the order of like 20 megabytes for each JPEG. And that's for a 61 megapixel picture. I imagine shooting RAW, that's going to be even more unwieldy. It's going to fill up your hard drive so fast. Anyway, not for me. All right, I spent way too much time talking about that sensor. So the other thing is video. So once again, the Sony A7R IV does 8-bit 420 and 422, which is nothing new. And I know this is going to give a lot of kind of pro filmmakers a lot of grief. Honestly, most people are not going to care that much, Like, if you look at the people who are using the A7 series cameras to make video, it's generally people on like YouTube. And like, what kind of color grading are you really doing that you need all those bits? But I mean, I'm speaking from relative inexperience, so clearly I don't need it, but I'm sure there are people out there who can use it. Anyway, again, not that interesting. Of course, it still does S-Log2, S-Log3, and HDR. No recording time limit. That's perfect. The first camera that Sony put out without a recording time limit was the A6400, which is what I'm recording on now. So this is the first A7 series camera that has that, so that's great. Awesome. All right, real-time eye autofocus for movies. So that is pretty cool because, as you may know, the A6400 and along with the other A7 series cameras after firmware updates, they do really good eye autofocus, but only for photography. When it comes to video work, it still just defaults to face autofocus. So the fact that it does eye autofocus in real time for video is a new feature. That said, does it really make that much of a difference? I argue not really. Again, if you just do this kind of amateur work, it's not you're hardly going to notice it. I only ever notice that my camera doesn't nail perfect eye focus when I zoom into my photos at 100% and I look for like the little lines on my iris. That's how I know if I've nailed eye autofocus. Clearly not going to do that for movies, right? There's enough movement that movement creates more subject blur than the actual focal plane being not exactly right on your eyes. So eye autofocus for movies, I think, is a bit overkill. It's nice to have, certainly not a game changer, I think, for most people. Where I think it will make a big difference, though, is that they allow for animal eye autofocus in video. Because for most of us, the plane of our face is pretty close to the plane of our eyes, and so as long as you have face autofocus, your eyes are going to be pretty close. But that is not true for animals, because animals tend to have long snouts or long beaks, and so if they're facing you, the snouts are clearly much closer to the camera than their eyes, and so you can tell when the eyes are out of focus. And so having autofocus for videos for animals would make animal videography a lot easier. Image stabilization, that's awesome. I think Sony's always been putting image stabilization in their A7 series cameras. Still boggles my mind why they don't put it in the A6000 series cameras. But anyway. So the A7R IV got a better viewfinder, which is great. So it's supposed to have better Wi-Fi connectivity. It's supposed to have 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, so it's going to be faster. Thank goodness, because as you saw in one of my previous videos, I tried to do Wi-Fi video from my A6400 to my iPhone, and that was such a slow, stuttery mess. And it looks like you can use the PC to remotely control your A7R IV, which is great. It's good for people who do a lot of studio work. It's got a USB-C port, which is awesome, finally. I hate that so many electronics manufacturers are so slow in adopting USB-C. Basically, the only real segment that has embraced USB-C is the Android phone market. I have had 3 laptops now that have had USB-C ports, and I don't own a single USB-C cable because I got nothing to connect to them. So yeah, it's been very slow on the uptake, but I'm glad to see that it's finally there. All right, and the price, $3,500. If that doesn't convince you that this camera is not for the average Joe Schmo, yeah. So anyway, that's it. I think to sum it all up, it's like what I said before. This camera, even though it's marketed to the mass public, and it's in a body that resembles an enthusiast camera, i.e. the A7 Mark III, it does not make this at all a camera for the average person. This is very clearly aimed at a small segment of the photography market, namely people who need to do professional work and need to do very large prints. So yeah, it sucks. People are going to look at this and going to wonder who this is for. They're going to think it's overpriced, and it's not for them. It's too bad. I wish Sony would just advertise us to pros. It would result in a lot less unnecessary grief amongst the public, but I don't know how you could do that. So anyway, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.